Hello, welcome to this double edition of the CGSP interview and the China in Africa podcast. And today we are going to talk about China-Africa military relation. And I want to talk about it because for the last few months, especially after FOCAC and since last year as well, we've heard a lots of comments talking about China military presence in Africa, how it's growing. We had conversation about China private military companies in Africa. How do they operate? Are they carrying guns or not? What they're doing, who they are, how they're approaching. And there've been a lot of concern coming from African Western country in the US and Europe, trying to understand how China military is moving in Africa. So since the last FOCAC, China announced that, we're going to ramp up our training for military officers in Africa within the armies and other security forces. So when they did that, some people were kind of surprised. Somehow, many of them were discovering apparently they were finding out that China was that's involved in training military officers in Africa. So it's also happened last year when China really was selling weapons to many African countries, among which we have the DRC, which is fighting a Rwanda-backed rebellion in the eastern part of the DRC. When China was selling attacking drones, there are reports China is fueling wars in the eastern part of the DRC, as if people were really finding out for the first time that China is selling weapons to African country, which is not the first time. And we also had 2022, 2023, we had military exercise where China was doing military exercise with Russia, South Africa, Algeria, and it's really blew up, and it really puts even South Africa on the crosshair of many in Washington DC, where many were like, what, this proximity that South Africa is showing with China and Russia is not really good for South Africa, it's not really good for the US anyway. So we saw that in John, we saw all that development, and you could have that sense that people were kind of like, what China is doing in Africa, we don't really understand in terms of security and everything. So I say, let's have this conversation today. And to talk about it, we're going to have someone we used to have, we often have in this show, and it's really nice to have him. He's a good friend of China in the China Global South. And we're going to receive his name, as you can see, is Paul Nantulya. Paul Nantulya is a research associate at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C. Good evening, Paul.
Well, good evening. Thank you, Geraud. It's always nice to join you on this platform, and I'm very honored to be here again.
Oh yes, I'm very happy to have you. So you've heard my introduction. You heard what I've talked about, the different element pieces that I've mentioned. You recently released a report talking about the growing militarizations of China-Africa relation. But before diving into that, you heard me presenting things. You heard me introducing the topic. Tell me what's the spectrum, not the spectrum, but what's the characteristic today of China-Africa military relation today?
No, Geraud, thank you very much for that. As you were talking, I was just thinking to myself, the number of military interactions that the Chinese People's Liberation Army and other elements of China's armed forces, such as the People's Armed Police, the number of interactions they have with African militaries, with African political parties and African police and law enforcement, even intelligence organizations and paramilitaries, is something that has been, these interactions are ongoing, they are year-round, but they don't generate the level of policy or media interest that you would expect.
Mm-hmm.
Media interest both on the African continent, but then even globally, right?
Yeah.
Essentially it's a black hole. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. One, there has been a general view that what happens in Africa is really not it doesn't really amount to significant global impact or it doesn't attract as much global policy and media attention, right?
Yeah.
Africa is a continent that produces refugees, produces humanitarian
Crisis, yeah.
ethnic, genocide, and if you're not dealing with those things, you're dealing with Al-Shabaab, you're dealing with terrorists. If you're not dealing with terrorists, then you're dealing with
natural resources that you need to extract from.
Yes, and so the continent is seen in that light, and so China-Africa relations and China-Africa military relations really do not generate the kind of interest that, for instance, what China is doing, what the Chinese military is doing in the Western Pacific, in the immediate vicinity of the Western Pacific, or in South Asia, or in the Caucasus. It's almost like night and day. The other element is that the activities of the People's Liberation Army and organization, like the Chinese Special Forces and the Chinese police commanders, if you look at the academic and the policy thinking that revolves around these entities, it's mainly limited to, for instance, the South China Sea, where you have all these interlocking territorial disputes, and you have a lot of activity in terms of land that is being reclaimed by the People's Republic of China, which is then being converted for both civilian and military dual-use purposes and things of that nature, right? So that is really seen as a hot-button issue that affects the flow of international trade. The other element is, Taiwan, obviously, will the PLA invade? If so, when, there's been some talk of, some people even put dates on it, and so it generates a certain
paranoia or
certain interest in it. And then, what happens in Africa is kind of, it's in the back burner. But I argue, and I think I prove through empirical evidence that we should be paying a lot more attention to Chinese military activity in Africa. It's not ad hoc. It's become very systematic. It's become very focused. In fact, I've argued, even in this report, that, and I think the Chinese would also characterize it in that way, that Africa is essentially a proving ground. Africa is a testing ground. This is something I talked about, I think 2 years ago when I was working on the possibility of, more Chinese basing arrangements on the African continent. I argued then, as I argue now, and I believe the Chinese would also characterize it in a similar way, that the African continent basically offers the People's Liberation Army and China's other armed forces an opportunity to develop expeditionary capabilities, because China cannot realize its long-term objectives without becoming a true expeditionary force. In other words, a force that is able to project and sustain military power across vast distances, extending beyond the immediate periphery of the Western Pacific. This is what an expeditionary force looks like.
And how Africa fits, how Africa is fitting in that strategy?
So Africa fits into it, one, because of distance.
Okay.
Right? So since 2008, the People's Liberation Army has maintained continuous naval flotillas around the Gulf of Aden, conducting anti-piracy patrols. The 46th Naval Task Force left Chinese waters 2 days ago, and they're deployed. Each flotilla is deployed for about 4 months, and they'll conduct counter-piracy operations. But then they will also conduct military exercises with African forces. They will do. They will support humanitarian evacuation. Military operations other than war. Right.
Okay.
And they will do all kinds of things. And then from there, they will not go back to home port in China. They will circumnavigate into the Atlantic Ocean, into the Mediterranean sometimes, and then back into the Pacific. So what basically start out as 3 to 4 month deployments end up becoming 8, sometimes even 10-month deployments.
10 months, yes.
So in other words, what is happening is that the African waters have become a proving ground or a testing ground for China to actually develop expeditionary. This is what we call expeditionary operations. If we look at what the exercises, like this report talks about how China's military to military exercises have developed and have evolved over time, right? They've become more complex over longer duration. They've become more demanding, right? In terms of, it's no longer simply about, training for maritime safety and security. I mean, if you look at this exercise that was done with the Tanzanian forces, they had amphibious landings, right? They had all kinds of operations. They used the Y-20 aircraft for the first time, right? This is China's answer to the U.S. Globemaster.
Exactly. The Y-20 that China is now trying to sell to Nigeria. I've read the reports, and South Africa as well. They even showed that in South Africa a few months ago in Pretoria. So there is really that need of
Yes, and Namibia has just taken delivery of the Y9, right? Which again is so essentially, and so you look at that, and so you look at the nature of the exercises. You look at the distance, right? The distance involved. So, for instance, the Y-20 was deployed in Belarus. There was an exercise that took place in Belarus just a month before the Tanzania exercise. So you had the deployment of the Y-20, but the Y-20's deployment into Tanzanian waters was of a much greater distance, right? So China effectively is practicing expeditionary operations, and if you look at the assets that the PLA Navy is deploying in African waters, I mean, they're deploying newer and more sophisticated platforms, right, which are appearing in African waters, right? At one point, I think even a submarine was deployed in some of these exercises. These are newer versions, frigates, destroyers, and so what you have, and there's a notable Chinese military analyst, a former colonel, who actually commanded these operations in the Gulf of Aden for over 8 years. His name is Zhou Bo, and he says that this is one way in which China, without fighting a war, without firing a shot, is basically slowly, incrementally developing its power projection capabilities, and even describing these as power projection. So Africa then becomes more than just a back burner issue. China is very much at the frontal end of China's pursuit of developing of expeditionary operations, and this is just in the area of expeditionary operations.
Exactly. So basically,
other areas as well.
We're gonna delve into that. So basically, Africa is now becoming that sparring partner that China is looking into, working with, into developing its own projection capabilities. And African waters being friendly waters with friendly countries where you can really deploy that and try to really learn these capabilities and also exercise those capabilities. And you mentioned those exercises, and something really caught my attention. And when I was hearing you, and I've kind of like, maybe that's what made sense. Because when I looked at the list of the country that did exercise with combined exercise with China alone, or with China with other partners, I realized that there's almost, unless I'm mistaken, there's almost no non-coastal countries. All those countries were coastal countries. They have access to water, either Indian Oceans or either Atlantic Oceans, but all of them were coastal countries. So is it really on purpose that, China is not picking up country like Zimbabwe being really close to China, but not having access to water, not picking up like the DRC, for example? That is another story. That not picking up, for example, Rwanda or Uganda or all those inland countries which don't have access to water. Is that because China is looking into having sparring partner to really exercise all its capabilities on the continent?
Yeah, the answer to that is when you're thinking expeditionary operations, when you're thinking power projection, you're basically thinking maritime and air.
Yeah.
Right? These are maritime operations. And the People's Liberation Army was initially an infantry heavy force. So it was mostly infantry. It was a land force. China saw itself as a potential land power. Not really a maritime. Yes, in history, there have been moments in history where China was a major naval power, a major maritime power. So, for instance, during the Song dynasty, the days of Zheng He, who was the famous Marine admiral, and it's interesting because he continues to be invoked even in the Belt and Road. Actually, when you go to Kenya, if you go to Mombasa, and I was there, if you go to Mombasa, there's this monument to Zheng He at the point at which the Nairobi to Mombasa standard gauge railway, Mombasa to Nairobi standard gauge railway, and so they were talking about Zheng He and Wang Yi, and when they explain the Belt and Road Initiative and how it has moved. The different nodes of the Belt and Road in Africa are framed within the concept of this Zheng Heism, right? So the maritime area, and when you look at the China's evolving defense strategic guidance, if you look at the defense white papers going all the way back to 2013, the Chinese have said explicitly that you grasp the maritime domain, and you grasp power, you grasp opportunity, right? So China's defense horizons over the last 25 to 30 years, China's defense horizons have shifted from land to sea.
Okay.
And so when you look at the leadership of the Chinese People's Liberation Army right now, you have admirals, right, that are in the structure. Actually, if you look at the Central Military Commission and you look at the leadership, it was initially coming from the PLA, from the ground forces. Now, a lot of that leadership is increasingly coming from the Navy.
The naval force, yeah.
So maritime air has become very important, and that is precisely one of the reasons why most of China's, I would say 90%, maybe even 95% of the military exercises that China is doing with African militaries, these are essentially navies, right? These are navies and coast guards, and these are countries, as you rightly say, have a coastline. Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, South Africa, and so on.
Nigeria,
right?
Yeah.
Yes. So you're absolutely right, and a lot of the ports that can birth major PLA combatants, these are ports that have been constructed or refurbished or repurposed or financed by Chinese state-owned enterprises that have become champions of the Belt and Road.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a sense that you have a mixing of commercial and
military at the same time.
Yes, but mostly in a maritime domain. And you see, within Chinese strategic thinking, there's a very thin line between maritime and naval.
Yeah.
When you look at Western forces, like you look at the U.S. military, it's distinct. So what the Coast Guard is doing is very distinct from what the U.S. Navy does, right?
Okay.
But in the Chinese context, and if you look at the military writings, if you look at the maritime writings, military and naval, sometimes they even use terms interchangeably. Right?
Yeah.
So and you have the Coast Guard and elements of the Merchant Marine that are administratively part of the People's Liberation Army. So they're really not civilian or civil in the way that you'd understand
exactly.
it in the US. But having said that, Geraud, there are countries without a coastline.
Okay.
That train with the PLA. Ethiopia is one of those countries, right?
Yeah, true.
So with Ethiopia, for instance, Ethiopia has this very interesting arrangement with the PLA. So at the National Defense University in Beijing, there is a program. So they have a school that is called the International College for Defense Studies, the ICDS, which is very popular with African militaries. In that ICDS, right, these African officers go there and they graduate with, they pass out with what is essentially a Master of Science degree in defense and strategic studies or defense and security studies. Within that, there is a specific program for Ethiopian officers.
Okay.
That has been running since 2015. And this program basically this is what you'd call it's a finishing school. Ethiopians that have been marked to become general officers in the Ethiopian military. So they go to China and they do this program, but the program is specifically tailored to Ethiopia. And when you talk to people in the know of the Chinese military system, so there's an entity called the Academy of Military Science, which operates directly under the Central Military Commission, right? So when you talk to people who analyze this AMS very, very closely, they'll tell you that this Ethiopian course is something that the PLA would like to extend to other African countries, right? Then you look at countries like Uganda. You look at countries like Uganda. China has a very interesting dynamic in Uganda in the sense that just the other day, Norinco, which is the major defense arm, defense industry arm, right, is developing a capability together with the Ugandan defense industries to assemble drones, Chinese drones.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's been that investment by Norinco. There's been that investment by the Ugandan security services.
Yeah.
Right? Uganda is going to become one of the nodes for the manufacture and assembly of Chinese drone technology. Right?
Yeah.
Now that's a major development.
Yeah.
You look at Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has instructors, Chinese instructors. Of course, the Zimbabwe Staff College and quite a number of Zimbabwe military installations are built by Chinese state-owned enterprises, and so there's a very, very close relationship there between China and Zimbabwe. And we can look at any number of African countries that have got similar sorts of relationships with the PLA. They might not have a coastline, but they do have strong relations with the PLA. So it's very multifaceted.
Yeah. And you mentioned things that really open doors to many elements I'd like to touch upon on this show here. In the report, you mentioned the case of Chinese security norms. And it really reflects to me when you mentioned the case of Ethiopian officers in ICDS and how some of them would like to see those, what would they do with Ethiopian officers to be also replicated in other African countries. Can you tell us a bit more about what Chinese security norm look like and how they would be implemented in African context? Because this has been something that many have been worried about, because we tend to talk about Chinese trying to export their political norm, the political system, but we never or not so often talk about Chinese norms when it comes to security or military training or approach to security norms. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, so the Chinese definitely have a normative architecture and a normative framework within the military establishment. Some old approaches to security. One of which, basically, the definition of security itself.
Yeah.
What is security in the Chinese context? In the Chinese context, security is about the survival, the strength, the legitimacy, and the longevity of the ruling party. And the People's Liberation Army, which is the largest military in the world, and the Navy, which is the largest navy in the world, and China also has the largest coast guard in the world, all that is not controlled by the Ministry of Defense. So the Minister of Defense might be a general, he's a general officer, and he might sit on the Central Military Commission. But the Ministry of Defense basically just simply administers. The command and control comes from the Chinese Communist Party. It comes from the Central Military Commission, which is a party structure.
Okay.
That's where command and control comes from, right? And the reason it is structured that way, one, it's an old Soviet model, but two, it comports with the Chinese concept of regime stability.
Exactly.
The Chinese call it stability maintenance. Wei wen. This is in Chinese. Wei wen. Stability maintenance, right? which is the survival of the regime. So the officers of the PLA itself, it's a party army. It's not an
State
army.
army.
It's not a state. It's not it's a party army, right? So that concept. So that's one of the norms. The other norm is, of course, the norm of non-interference, which non-interference is a euphemism for Western, the whole idea of what the Chinese call a national army.
Exactly.
Jundui Goja,
Exactly.
Jundui Goja. It's the national army, which is for them. When you look at the Chinese writings, and when the reform process started, there were some segments of the PLA that were basically wanting to revisit this, and there was this editorial that was put out that immediately shut that debate. That basically says, should China lose its whole concept of a army that listens to the commands and wishes of the ruling party and adopt the concept of a national, what they call a national army,
yeah.
then it will lose its soul, and it could even lead to the overthrow of the CCP. Now, that is a very serious authoritative statement that talks about the norm, the normative function, right? So again, non-interference and so on, and that sort of thing. Now, these obviously filter through the Chinese military education experience. So when these officers go to China, they will receive instruction from people from the National People's Congress. They will receive instruction from people from the AMS, so they will be exposed to the Chinese way of doing things. They'll be exposed to Chinese norms. I have a book that I like reading here. It's the only official account of the Chinese military from the eyes of foreign officers. So the book is called China in the Eyes of Foreign Officers. It's been published. It's been published in Chinese, in English, in French, and I think in Portuguese, and Portuguese and Spanish, right? Because they get these officers from all of the African continent. And although it's called China in the Eyes of Foreign Officers, 80% of it is African officers. And when you look at what those African officers have written, you can see through those writings, you can see the kind of things they're exposed to.
Yes.
So the norm of Weiwen, the norm of a national army versus a party army, right?
Yeah.
The norms of non-interference, the norm of party and army going together.
Exactly. Yeah.
So what an American officer would call civil military fusion.
Exactly.
In the Chinese context, is slightly different because yes, the party is civilian, but when you talk of civil military fusion in the American context, you don't hear about the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. It's this real civil military. In the Chinese concept, is very different. So again, that's a norm, and many of these norms come together in the Global Security Initiative, the GSI.
Say yes.
Which was identified very clearly at the FOCAC summit, the recent Forum for China Africa. The military component and the police component of the current FOCAC program has all been framed within the context of the Global Security Initiative. So the Forum for China Africa Cooperation is understood by the Chinese military establishment as a platform to begin putting flesh on the concept of the Global Security Initiative.
Yes.
And the Global Security Initiative, it's a basket of norms that we've discussed earlier, that looks at regime contact, regime security, and all this is, and China is basically saying, look, China is a power, and the world must listen to the kind of norms that and that's the argument that is coming from the Chinese side. Yeah.
Non-represented like this. How to so the criticism that's gonna come from even within Africa civil society and democratic movement to say, you know what, exposing our military to this kind of thinking will lead our military to become force of anti-democratization or force of serving one party instead of serving the states. So exposing our military into those kind of norms can be dangerous for our own African democracy, given that when you look at African demands, there's is that strong demand for democracy. But how do you reconcile that demand for strong democracy, same time for state stability, but also having military being trained, officers being trained by, being trained to know that we are serving not the country, but we are serving the political party who's in power?
Look, there are a number of touch points, and I think I would focus on three. The first is that China is actually training more African officers than any other industrialized country. China is training more officers than the US, the UK, France, Belgium, at a rate of about 2,000 a year, at least since 2015. 2015, that FOCAC summit of 2015, which I think took place I think it was in Cairo, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, Cairo, yes, yeah.
This is when peace and security was really established as a FOCAC program. And ever since then, we've seen, military and so on really developing as a major pillar. In fact, from the FOCAC summit that took place in September, they've already had 3 or 4 activities under the China-Africa peace and the China-Africa Defense Forum. Yes, right? So it's definitely something they're looking at very closely. So I think that's the first touch point, is that the cream of Africa's generals and senior officers, right, are being exposed on an annual basis. This is highly subsidized training. African officers have access to. There are 70, I believe, 70 officer academic institutions in China. They were reduced from about 120 in the current reforms. Most of these are available to African officers. So the academies of the army, the navy, the marines, and so on. There are quite a number. The medical universities and so on.
Yeah.
All of it. So that's one. So when Africans look back and say, but we have all, our officers are basically, China is playing a major role in shaping the mindsets of many of these officers. So that's the first touch point. The second touch point is that a lot of African countries come from a similar heritage as that.
Mm-hmm.
So, countries like Uganda still have a political commissar system.
Yeah.
Political commissars are political cadres that are responsible for political and ideological education within a military. And in the Ugandan military, a political commissar and a commander are of co-equal rank and authority, which is similar to China. That is not to say that Uganda is copying China. Mm-hmm. It is to say that the Ugandan military, which evolved from a liberation movement, ascribes to similar notions.
Exactly.
And so when Ugandan officers
and values,
So when Ugandan officers show up at Army Command College in Nigeria, right, and they are going through their program, that teaching is already embedded in their own thinking, right?
Paul,
and so
that makes sense for a country like Uganda, Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Namibia, Mozambique, South Africa, country. Exactly, country that really had that fighting liberation army. But when they have that liberation concept. But when you move beyond those countries, you go to Gabon, you go to Ghana, you go to West Africa, you go to Senegal, you go to Kenya, you get to Tanzania,
Liberia.
Yeah. You don't have that similar background, and you have you have the background of civil wars of like in Liberia, in Ghana, in all those. You have those, not Ghana, but you have those background of civil wars. So when you put that in context, how now that mindset is reconciling with a country that came out of civil wars, that's walking into democratization, that's looking into multipartyism, and that's looking into and when you have civil unrest, you're gonna have civilian looking into the military for them to stand up and to protect them against the ruling party that's now seen as being a danger to the country.
It's still a form of exposure.
Yeah.
Because they still go there. So this publication I mentioned earlier, there are officers from Nigeria, from Sierra Leone, that were talking about the impressions of China and so on. And you can see that it filters, in terms of the analysis and so on, right? So true, they may not have that kind of background, but they're still exposed to it. Some of them might not even necessarily buy the ideology or the concept, but may be attracted to the whole idea of controlling a military to such an extent that it does not
become a force
a
against the
danger,
power,
a danger
against
to
the ruling party.
power. Yeah. And I tell you, I was talking, and I may have talked about this in one of my reports. I was talking to to one officer in particular from one of those African countries that does not have a liberation movement heritage, who basically said, my superiors admire the fact that the PLA, a million strong People's Liberation Army, has never orchestrated a coup against the Chinese Communist Party, right? It has never orchestrated a coup. It has remained subordinate and loyal to the CCP. And so this officer was basically saying, my leadership admire that.
We'd like to have something like that.
And they want to learn. Yes, they want to learn about the techniques, the control techniques that the CCP has employed to keep the PLA obedient to party wishes and commands to such an extent that a coup is not even possible, right?
Yeah.
And, this is worth paying a lot of attention to because when you look at a country like Kenya, for instance, I love to use Kenya as an example. Kenya was heavily pro-West during the Cold War. In fact, there was a point at which Kenya expelled, the Chinese embassy, closed down the Chinese embassy. All these, Soviet,
leaning Cuba and all of that. Yeah,
had a rough time in Nairobi because Nairobi was very friendly. In fact, it was seen and described, and actually sometimes Nairobi described itself as a bulwark against communism in Africa, right? But much as Kenya was pro-US and pro-West, when President Daniel Arap Moi, especially after the failed coup of 1982, regime stability became basically the number one issue, right? So we gradually began to see the ruling party at the time, KANU, the Kenya African National Union, developed a multifaceted, deep relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. And then we began to see the Kenya Defense Forces, which still prides itself as an apolitical force that does not intervene
in political affairs. Yeah,
we began to see a trend that has not stopped of Kenyan officers becoming regular students in Chinese military institutions. Now, it's not now. I think KANU, the ruling party, and these officers, they're not buying the ideology. But what the KANU and the Moi government were mostly interested in were the elements of control.
Exactly.
What tactics is the CCP using to control the PLA that might assist KANU
do the same,
and the Kenya government do the same to ensure that a 1982 coup attempt does not occur again. And indeed, there has never been another coup attempt since 1982 in Kenya. You understand? So there are African countries that do not come from that heritage, but which are basically looking at the methods. They're looking at the method of control. And China does have quite a bit to teach when it comes to these sorts of things. But it does raise valid questions from African civil society organizations and pro-democracy movements about what the officers are learning, especially because, with all these elections, the fraudulent elections, the election, you see the military being rolled out.
Exactly.
And clashing constantly, and it leads to human rights violations. And so, from that perspective, the PLA is feared.
For its influence.
Yes, it's feared. The People's Liberation Army in many African quarters is actually feared. It's feared in the sense that it has the potential to influence African military officers in a negative way, and in a context where there's a resistance to democratic backsliding. There's resistance to third termism and fourth
Exactly.
termism and fifth termism and sixth
Yeah.
termism. There's a resistance to that. And that resistance is being met by countervailing military force.
Exactly.
And many of these military officers are receiving their education in places that are built around this Weiwen concept,
Exactly.
which could be a very bad thing for Africa. So I think in this particular area, the Chinese side also need to tread carefully.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because China likes to be perceived as a brother,
Exactly.
friendly, and so on. And because that message has got to be received in a continent where 80% of the population is between 15 and 30,
Exactly.
and 70% of that population cohort demand democracy,
Let's see.
and 80% reject military rule,
Exactly.
and 85% reject the idea of a military that is controlled by a ruling party. If I were in the political work department of the Central Military Commission in Beijing, this is something I would be looking at very, very carefully.
Exactly.
Because it could affect, there's a reputational cost to it, and it may undermine
Exactly.
China's image at a time when China wants to present itself as an alternative to the West.
Exactly, definitely, because people will not going to
Absolutely.
trust the fact that the military being exposed to norms that really are just countering the aspiration that people have, that people do have on the ground, and that's really something fascinating. Because for so long, for so many times, and I'm really happy to talk with to you today, people didn't really pay attention to those elements of norms of how China military norms are shaping the future of democracy in Africa, the future of political stability in Africa, and the future of the army and the role of the army and the security forces in Africa. We don't really, we only see the hard parts of it, the hardware part of it, equipment, strategies and everything, training. But beyond the training, there's an ideology behind, but that we should be paying careful attention to, because it may backfire on us, and something that's quite dangerous that we should be picking into. There's so many other things that we can do, and we can look into those norms, and I don't want to delve on that much, but I think we're gonna come back on that later. But let me get back to one of the points that you've mentioned in your reports about China security and China, how it's perceived in China security interest. One of the points, if I remember correctly, you mentioned about that China is trying also to protect its nationals overseas, and for so many years, the question of China private military securities have been one of the key points in talking point in the West, in Africa. How China is protecting its nationals, how China is dealing with the instability, case of Sudan, case of Djibouti, many cases where China has to intervene to protect its citizen, how China is moving into that. And I'm also going to combine that with one of the element also that you've mentioned earlier about the basing in Africa, because for so long it's been combined together in a sense where China needs those bases to be able to export its power, to be able to move from one part in Africa to another part of Africa, to be present when the PLA needs to be present. How is this? I don't know how to frame the question, but how is the situation right now regarding to those points? How those two elements are combined together and are working together?
Right. Geraud, I don't see how a serious scholar and a serious analyst of the Chinese military can ignore Africa. It's just as simple as that. And I think there needs to be some kind of change in the global community of PLA studies. There's a field that has developed, People's Liberation Army Studies, that brings thinkers around the world that follow different aspects, because the PLA is a very complicated organization. It's a very, very complex. And so you have those that look at equipment, you have those that look at modernization, you have those that look at technology, how is the PLA developing in terms of technology? You have those that look at power projection, so it's a whole range of things. But regardless of what we're looking at, I for one, do not see how a serious PLA scholar can ignore Africa. And I'll use that to kind of preface my entry into the two issues that you've addressed. Chinese nationals. So there are over 1 million Chinese nationals in Africa. These nationals, some of them are indigenized. So when you go to South Africa, for instance, you're going to find a community of Chinese that have been there since...
Fourth generation, fifth generation of Chinese living there.
Yes. In fact, there was a very interesting constitutional court pronounced itself. And it became very controversial in South Africa, where certainly these South Africans, this segment of South Africans, could be classified as previously underprivileged to then take advantage of black economic empowerment.
Exactly.
Right? It happened maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And there was a whole discussion around that, right? All Chinese, these Chinese communities. So that's one segment, right? Then you have the Chinese that came to Africa in different waves. For instance, to build the Tanzania-Zambia Railway and, in different kinds of projects and stuff like that. You have that second wave. Then you have the more recent wave, which have come as a result of Belt and Road contracts. And Africa was the biggest recipient of Belt and Road.
700 billion, if I remember correctly.
Yes. And just in 2023 alone.
Exactly.
Africa took about 70% of all Belt and Road
money.
Activity.
Yeah.
Yes, and so that money comes with workers, it comes with managers, it comes with professionals, Chinese professionals, it comes with students that are coming in to manage. It comes with banks, policy banks. There are policy banks now that have offices, Chinese policy banks like China Exim Bank, which have offices in Africa, in different African countries.
Exactly.
Chinese Development Bank and so on, and so on. So it's a presence. And when one looks at what is happening on the ground, right? Every other day, you just Google it. Chinese attack in West Africa, or East Africa. You're going to get a story of a kidnapping, hijacking, that sort of thing.
Hijacking right? in Gulf of Aden in Somalia, asking for 10 million.
Yes, and there have been pirates like in the Gulf of Guinea. Last week I was doing an interview on the Gulf of Guinea, and there have been ships that have been
attacked,
attacked by pirates and so on. So the dangers that not all, but certain politically important communities, and I think this is the operative term, politically important Chinese communities in Africa are being exposed to dangers that are finding their way up the national security architecture in Beijing to such an extent that Xi Jinping himself has intervened on a number of occasions. So if you remember last year, there was an incident in Nigeria, and Xi Jinping himself, he made a statement. He said, look, this has to be addressed, and China has to do A, B, C, and D. And so there was CID, Chinese CID. There was a group that was dispatched to Nigeria. There are a number of situations. Xi Jinping talked about South Sudan. What happened in South Sudan? I think it was in 2017 when oil workers had to be evacuated. And it was a major crisis because the Chinese security firm that had been deployed, Dewey Security, they did not have the capacity to actually conduct that evacuation. The Chinese had to rely on the Ugandans, and they also had to rely on different parts of the South Sudanese security service that were even fighting against each other.
Exactly.
Right? And so it has become an issue. And it's become an issue because these are politically important communities. Oil workers and so on. These are politically important. They're not like what we were talking about earlier. Right? So that's the first element. The second element is that the state-owned enterprises that are employing and looking after these communities are part and parcel of the political system back in China. So a CEO of a state-owned enterprise is a card-carrying member of the Chinese Communist Party and is going to be in the Politburo and so on. So they do their own lobbying in there. And so there's been a lot of pressure over the years for the People's Liberation Army to become much more muscular in terms of extending a security blanket to protect these interests. So what you're starting to see, especially with regard to these security firms, which are not private because
they're all ex-member of PLA.
PLA and whatnot. That discussion is part of this concept of security around politically important Chinese communities and constituents on the African continent. So it's the reason why the expansion of the Belt and Road into Africa went together with, for instance, the opening of a Chinese naval base in Djibouti. We've seen an increase in Chinese military exercises being done on the African continent. The countries that are trained most with the PLA are also countries that receive the highest amount of Belt and Road programs and assistance in China and Belt and Road investments. And these are the countries that host the highest number of Chinese state-owned enterprises that are implementing Belt and Road programs. So again, it's a combination of commerce, economics, finance, security, and military together. And because the PLA is still averse to deploying in large numbers outside of a peacekeeping mandate, the PLA is still quite averse.
Where that adversity where that sentiment's coming from? Before getting, but just tell us, where is it coming from? Because people see China being a strong power, big power, and everything, superpower. But somehow there's that sense. I know they're gonna talk about non-interference, but you also mentioned that sense of like being averse, being afraid, being unsure of being present on a land that they do not control, they do not understand. Where's that coming from? Where that feeling's coming from?
It comes from three places. One, it comes from, so when you look at PLA writings on expeditionary warfare and so on, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, if you look at the Academy of Military Science, if you look at all the military journals, PLA Daily, you look at Fixed Wing Journal, there are all these military journals. Some of them are in the public domain. When you look at what authoritative PLA officers are writing in these journals about expeditionary warfare, one begins to understand that the PLA does not believe that it is where that it has arrived to where it needs to arrive at. It's to have the kind of logistics and expeditionary capabilities that the U.S. military has.
Okay.
Now it's very interesting because in PLA writings, the U.S. military is a benchmark. China looks at the U.S. military as a benchmark, right? So there's a sense that China does not yet have. That the modernization has been growing rapidly. This is something that's even recognized in the U.S. that China has made, and even in this recent report that you're talking about, the annual report on the people's on Chinese military activity, the U.S. Department of Defense does recognize that the PLA has developed. I mean, it's now running indigenously produced aircraft carriers.
Exactly.
This was not even the case in 2012. When I first started looking at Chinese military much more closely, and at that time, if you made the argument that these guys are going to have a domestically produced carrier,
no one would have believed you.
People would have said, you're smoking, what the hell are you smoking? But today we're now on the verge of this. I mean, the Fujian, which is their second indigenously produced carrier, is currently being tested, right? And but nevertheless, despite that, the PLA still does not believe that it has the requisite power projection capabilities to be able to operate globally like the U.S. military, without a hitch and so on. So that's the first element. And the PLA is also very conscious of not embarrassing itself. The last thing you want to have is a Chinese contingent being deployed to do ABC
and failed, and have Somalia, and have Black Hawk situation.
Black Hawk situation. I mean, that is something that will completely, so that's number one. Number two, the Chinese are also very conscious of the African aversion to a foreign military footprint.
Okay.
So they've looked at the problems that, for instance, the UK military has faced in Kenya. You remember there was the burning of the...
Exactly.
It was an accident, but nevertheless, this conservatory, acres and acres of land that were burnt during a military exercise with the UK. The UK has this huge military presence in Kenya, and, a lot of that. And, there was a high court ruling that basically said that, this immunity, and so the Chinese look at that, and the Chinese find themselves at a time in Africa where you now have social media, you have things that are reported in real time. When the British established their base in Kenya, this was, this was not a time when people talked about things like that. But now it's become, so the Chinese are operating in an environment that is much more open, that is much more plural, an environment that that has, you have a greater level of media, investigative journalism and things of that nature. So they're very aware that there's that aversion, right? And so from an ideological standpoint, there's that, a PLA, a heavy PLA military footprint might not be the best thing. It might offend African sensibilities. And then the third is just basically what the PLA has taught itself. The PLA has been taught that when you have a big sort of sizable footprint overseas, it has to be within the context of a UN peacekeeping mission or a humanitarian operation and things of that nature. So, you can talk about these things and they're not going to, people are not going to find it offensive, right? It's not offensive. We are contributing to public good. The whole idea of responsible big power, Geraud Neema. Geraud Neema, it's just, there's that concept, right? So these are the security myths, because all militaries have security myths. So there are certain security myths of the PLA that the PLA has basically digested as part of its DNA. That makes it, sort of like it's a, you push here, you push there, it's slow. See what you can get, and so on. Even Djibouti, even the choice of Djibouti was very deliberate.
Yeah,
there are other foreign countries that have bases in Djibouti. So if China is to set up a base in Djibouti, for those countries to point a finger, it becomes a problem because you've got three fingers pointing back at you.
Exactly,
because you also have a base. The problem for the PLA is that Djibouti is very specific.
Yeah,
you don't have that. You can't have that in another African country. Yeah. So they're going to have to think about something else, and maybe the dual use model is something that
aversion. That aversion
that's what explains the aversion.
Yeah, that aversion that you mentioned, the factor of aversion, just now segue us back to the questions that I interrupted you on. Now the basing part of it, the basing. Exactly. Yes. Yes. Now we realize that basically there's not really much of argument of expecting or a second base on the Atlantic coast of Africa, given what you've mentioned. When you look at the PLA story and all those factors that you've mentioned, are we really? Can we really expect another PLA base in Africa?
I have argued that it should not be beyond the realm of possibility.
Yeah.
That the People's Republic of China is going to establish more military bases in the world and certainly on the African continent. Mm-hmm. That is my
assessment.
Broad, over the horizon assessment. But if you're to ask me when and where, then the conversation gets a little bit more complicated. But one can make can use the empirical evidence to make some pretty intelligent conclusions. It's highly likely that the next base will again be in a country that has a coast, in the maritime, because that only makes sense.
Yes.
Even from a Chinese perspective, it makes sense, right? China has invested in over 70 port developments from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of Africa to North Africa. Mm-hmm. In West Africa, West Africa, by the way, has the highest. They're 33.
Exactly. Yeah.
East Africa, they're 17. North Africa, they're 4. Southern Africa, there are 5 port developments. So West Africa actually has the highest. So most of China's high-value port developments
on the west coast
in Africa are on the west coast. In other words, they're on the Atlantic.
Yeah.
Right? So, and because of what we've seen in terms of the Chinese preference for a basing model that mixes commercial and military, right? This is what Djibouti was.
Yeah.
That's Dorale port in Djibouti was a commercial port. Mm-hmm. But then it was expanded to accommodate
upgraded
military.
it. Yeah.
upgraded, right? So it's a dual use facility. So if China has to leave for whatever reason, China hasn't, it's not going to be a major loss of treasure,
Yeah.
right? Because by its nature, it's what the concept the Chinese use is on a commercial platform.
Yeah.
So they talk about dual civil military, but on a commercial backbone.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, they can leave at any time.
Yeah.
It's a commercial backbone. It's a light footprint.
Yeah.
Right? And it's a mix, right? So when we look at that, we can apply it to a range of countries, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there was talk in the Namibian press, and
Walvis Bay, yeah.
Walvis Bay does have, it can birth, because I mean we've seen this with PLA exercises. The PLA port call, they can actually accommodate these destroyers and these naval assets and so on, right? So I think that's the second consideration. The third consideration would be, essentially countries that tend to rank high in China's system of partnership rankings, right?
Mm-hmm.
So China has a system of like there are 5 levels.
Yes.
Comprehensive, cooperative, security.
They even expanded it since the last talk. I realized that you have big 5, and within the 5 you have like sub levels that just makes it differently. Yeah.
Yes. So when you look at all the countries that host these high-level port developments, that host the highest number of PLA naval assets, that do the highest number of PLA military exercises, that send African officers to China on a more frequently than others, they tend to come from that basket of countries.
Okay.
So when we look at China's system of partnership rankings, we look at the port developments, we look at the historical ties between those countries and the Chinese Communist Party, and then we look at the roles that those countries play within the Belt and Road. We can then basically look at that and probably look at a few other indicators and basically say, look, if I was in the Joint Logistics Support Force office in Beijing, and I was told
to think of those countries,
but these are the countries that I'll think about. So yes, we do have. It's difficult to say for certain where they will be, and when.
Mm-hmm.
But one can use a set of indicators to basically say, we should perhaps be looking at these countries more closely. I mean, in terms of the possibility of Chinese basing arrangements, and even talk about what a Chinese base will look like. Mm-hmm. A Chinese overseas base is not going to look like a US base.
Yeah. Okay.
It's not going to look like a UK base. It's going to, with Chinese characteristics on a commercial platform, right?
Yeah.
This is, they like to talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Exactly.
Military training with Chinese
characteristic. Yeah.
Everything with Chinese characteristics. So this, you could say basing with Chinese characteristics.
This characteristic, yeah.
It's going to be very, very different from what we normally see.
So, Paul, I want to take much up of your time. We went even overboard to what I was scheduling for us to have this conversation, but you gave us some interesting insight, and I believe that people who are listening are really learning a lot about how to understand China's security presence in Africa and how it's working, how it's moving. So before leaving you, last question would be, if you're an African, you are civil society, or you're just an analyst, you want to understand, you want to have the tools to understand China's security presence on the continent. What would be your advice? Like your 3-point advice, like you should be looking into this and that to allow you to understand better how China is moving on the military base, on military front in Africa.
1, familiarize yourself with China's defense guidance. So look at all the defense policy white papers that have been released, because those white papers speak to the evolution of Chinese military strategy. So I think that would be the first piece of advice. Second piece of advice, familiarize yourself with authoritative Chinese military texts. And the one that I would recommend is Science of Military Strategy. Mm-hmm. The Science of Military Strategy is China's official military doctrinal textbook. and it has been updated 8 or 9 times over the last decade or so. It essentially contains everything that a China military analyst needs to know about the PLA. And there are a number. So there's the Science of Military Strategy, but then there are other books as well, right? That are produced by the official doctrinal textbooks that are produced by the Academy of Military Science, and you can get this. You can get it on. You can order copies. The third piece of advice I would recommend is develop a metric, a what do you call it, a matrix, a table, an Excel spreadsheet. Look at PLA Daily, look at People's Daily, and within PLA Daily and People's Day, People's Daily and PLA Daily, which is the official military mouthpiece, which report on PLA activities, and then just keep building it date by date. There was an exercise here, there was this here, there was this here, and then look at how that is being reported, how it's being reported in China and whatnot, and that then leads you to other official military publications. With those 3 elements, one can then begin to track PLA behavior over time, over a space of time. It's basically small pieces of activity, but after religiously doing this over 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, eventually you begin to see a pattern emerging. And that can then lead to, sort of deeper assessments of things. So I think these would be the 3 pieces of advice I would give to a young journalist looking to understand the PLA, or a young analyst trying to understand the Chinese military. I think these would be the three things I would look at. Maybe I might add a 4th: learn Chinese.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. There's no short.
Those
learn Chinese.
You're in a Chinese space, learn Chinese. Yeah. It's a must. And I can tell you for sure, you have to learn Chinese. That's the must.
Absolutely, learn Chinese, because 60% of the intent is in Chinese.
Yeah.
The 40% is for the consumption of, like, for instance, when they write a white paper, right? They will write a white paper in English. That's for an American audience.
Yeah.
Or a Western audience. But get that white paper in
English.
Chinese.
In Chinese version, it's much more comprehensive. It's much more larger, much more richer.
Much more comprehensive.
Yeah.
Much more comprehensive. So learn Chinese, invest in it. It's not that expensive in Africa, fortunately.
Now the Confucius Institute has been spreading all over the continent, even within the armies. Now you have officers learning Mandarin in different African countries. Yeah.
Yes. So and even outside the Confucius Institutes.
Yeah.
There are universities that offer there are universities that offer Chinese classes outside of the Confucius Institutes.
Yeah.
In fact, that's what I was referring to.
Yeah.
That is what I was referring to. That now in any African country, go to any private university, you will have Chinese language being offered outside of Confucius, and it's affordable. They actually even educate non-university. You can go and register and learn Chinese and do Chinese. And so this is for a young African analyst interested in Chinese military. Learn Chinese. There's no shortcut. So
the growing militarization of China's Africa policy. My last question will be: should Africa or the world be worried about that? Yes or no?
I think Africa and the world needs to pay attention to it. Needs to pay attention to it. Africa is a region that cannot be ignored when it comes to Chinese foreign policy. The Chinese make it very, very clear about that. And so we should pay attention to it. We should pay close attention to it. We shouldn't think of Africa as this this distant place that, it's not, it's all about Taiwan and whether China will invade Taiwan. Because Africa plays in the Taiwan space. When Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan,
all 54 African countries, 53, I remember, I tracked that.
Country after country.
Yeah.
Country after country, right? So even on those issues that are considered to be more pressing, the African countries are
part of the strategy.
Are part of that larger design. So, yeah, that's what I would say. It's worth paying very close attention to.
So, the title of the report that was published early December by the Africa Center for Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C., authored by our guest Paul Nantulya, The Growing Militarization of China's Africa Policy. It gives you an oversight on and a view of how Chinese military Africa relationship have been growing, expanding to many African countries, and hardware, software, a lot of things are happening there. There's a lot of questions I wanted to ask Paul, but we really went overboard. I think I'm going to have him another time to continue this conversation. I think that our audience appreciated so much. So I'm going to see you next time for another edition of the CGSP interview. Bye-bye.